Hey, welcome to another lesson in the Old Testament. And this week, we're going to really start breaking down the Old Testament and try to understand the significance behind it. And I think it's so important to kind of see the Old Testament as putting together a large puzzle. Maybe you like to put together puzzles, 500,000, 5,000 pieces. Well, you open the contents of the puzzle, you pour everything out, and immediately what's the first thing we start doing? We look for the corners. And then we start trying to piece everything in. But if you don't have a particular part of the puzzle, you're going to be lost. And that particular part of the puzzle is the picture on the box, because the picture on the box tells us what the puzzle is supposed to look at. So one of the problems we have with the Old Testament is that some people look at the Old Testament as far as a novel, that it's a story, and that I'm supposed to open up the Bible and I start in Genesis and I'm going to go all the way to Malachi and I'm going to read it in order. And after I read it in order, I'm going to say, got it. I understand how this ties in, the way it works. But that's not the way the Old Testament was written. Sure, you can start with Genesis and you can go to Genesis and Exodus, and there's some awesome stories in there, some amazing miracles, and some really cool stuff. But then you're going to get Leviticus and Numbers, and you're going to be like, forget this. I don't get it. I don't understand. And so we have to start with understanding the Old Testament is not to be read necessarily Genesis to Malachi, but that the Old Testament is divided up into 5 sections. There's law, there's history, there's poetry, there's major prophets, and then there's minor prophets. And so if we start looking at it that way, we can kind of see that certain parts, like the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, can help us understand the history, which then allows us to see why the law is so important. So it's not designed to look at it from Genesis to Malachi, but basically it's divided into many different parts. And so then you start trying to put the pieces of the puzzle into specific areas. So the Old Testament story can be divided into 4 time periods, or what we could call 4 eras. The first era is what's known as the beginning, and it consists of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers. And notice right there, we've already skipped kind of Leviticus, right? So the second area is called like the settlement area. So we went from beginning, and then we're going to settlement, and you'll find settlement, which is found in Joshua and Judges. And then the third area is basically known as the kingdom area. This is when you start talking about the kings of the kingdoms. There's 2 kingdoms. And that is found in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Kind of makes sense, right? Because kings, kingdom kind of goes together. But at the end of the 2nd Kings, we'll start to see that Israel is going to be conquered by the Babylonians. The temple is destroyed. Jerusalem's walls are taken down. The people are taken to Babylon, and they serve there as slaves for a period of 70 years. And so 70 years later, they're going to be released by a group of people known as Persians, Cyrus the Great. They're allowed to return back to their homeland. They're able to rebuild their temple, their city, and their lives. And that's called the exile and reconstruction. So you go from beginnings to settlement to kingdom to exile and then reconstruction. And you find reconstruction and the exile in Ezra and Nehemiah. Now that's very, very broad, right? I've taken all of the 39 books and I've kind of just really made it concise. And notice I skipped out a lot of stuff. But that's kind of how you begin to understand how the story goes. So that's like a bird's eye view, if you will. So you have to understand that big picture, right? So looking at beginnings. Genesis, the actual word Genesis means beginning. The book tells us everything that began with God's act of creation. The book opens up, the Bible opens up by saying, in the beginning, in the Genesis, God created the universe and the world and basically the first human beings. And then it describes the beginnings of humanity, right? The animals, the air, the planets, you, me. But also, it helps us understand the beginnings of sin. and how sin comes into our lives and the tragic result of those sin. And we see this in the story of Noah and the flood, and how Noah was so strong in being rebellious to who God was. And then we go into Genesis, and we start Genesis chapter 12, and we look at Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the fathers of the Jewish people. And then the rest of the Old Testament after Genesis is basically talking about God's relationship with Israel. And that story begins in Genesis chapter 12. And of course, the book of Genesis ends with Abraham's descendants living in Egypt in a very wonderful relationship, if you will, with Pharaoh. And then you go into Exodus. And Exodus moves the Old Testament story forward. There's a period of, say, 400 years between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, and we see that Abraham's descendants become slaves. They become enslaved by the Egyptians. They long to get out of Egypt. Moses comes and through a series of plagues leads Israel out of Egypt, across the Red Sea and down to Mount Sinai, where they receive the 10 Commandments and the other, get this, 613 laws from God that governs their lives through the Old Testament, right? And then after beginnings, you then move to the settlement area. And with the settlement area, that's Joshua and Judges of the Old Testament. And this talks about Israel's success, their victories as they become free from being enslaved. And then, they march on and they conquer new land. And Israel conquers what's known as Canaan, a land that is flowing with milk and honey. And they divide the land between 12 tribes. They establish communities. They establish cities and government and laws and a way of life. It's a community. And God opens up in a miraculous way the Jordan River, which basically allows them to cross over into their new home on dry land. And you start to see the confidence in God's presence that is found during this period of settlement. But then what happens is people rebel. They rebel against God. They decide they don't want God. They don't want his laws. And so we get into the book of Judges, and it describes Israel's rebellion and the results that come when the people rebel, kind of like what sin does and how we rebel against God. So then that leads us to what's known as the kingdom area. And I'll talk real quick about the kingdom area, but the theme of Judges was that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was anarchy, there was lawlessness, there was all of these terrible, terrible things. And so Israel desires there to be a king, someone to come in, someone who will restore the community, that will bring back, what God intended for it to be. And so Samuel is Israel's last judge, and then he introduces what's known as the kingdom area, and they anoint Saul, who will be Israel's first king. 2 Samuel describes the rise of a man named David. You'll know King David, David and Goliath, and his reign in Israel's most glorious days. And then 1 King talks about Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon in his reign, and how Israel would construct a beautiful temple. And then through 1 Kings and 2 Kings, we start to see how Israel, once again, they fight. They rebel, and so the kingdom, this glorious kingdom, will be ripped apart and set apart into two kingdoms. And then that, of course, leads to exile, because evil kings come in, sin comes in, starts to destroy the people, and there will be this group of people known as the Babylonians who come in, and they basically capture the Israelites. I mentioned earlier the Persians will eventually come after many, many years and will restore the captive Jews and will bring about resources for them to rebuild their temple and their city and their lives. And that's where we see the book of Ezra and Nehemiah kind of come in. And that's where the Old Testament story technically ends. So let me sum it up real quick. So the Old Testament, not to be read from cover to cover, but rather to be seen as a story that has great success, but also has tragic failure. But it's a story of God's faithfulness, that no matter where we are in life, no matter what's going on, that God is still present, that God is still at work, that God is still moving. And it's a story of Israel's abuse of their freedom to make choices. God gave them the freedom. They abused it. They took advantage of God, and they paid for it. It describes the tragic consequences that come when God's directions are ignored, when we choose to ignore what God wants us to be and to do, and we see the consequences from that. But the best part of the story is that at the end of the Old Testament, after all of the success, but now all of the failures, all of the rebellion, all of the sin, all of the turning their back from God, all of the rejection, all of these terrible, terrible things, the end of the Old Testament ends with God not abandoning his promises and still loving his people patiently, carefully. Kind of the same God that does the very same thing to us. That, my friends, is a quick summation of the Old Testament and why we need to study. Because the Old Testament is a story of God and his relationship with people. And it helps us understand God and his relationship to us. And what happens if we choose to reject the leadership and the direction of God. Hopefully this helped a little bit.